On a hot and humid Tuesday, 24-year-old Mandi Alexander went into work a closing shift. She had just been hired on at a discount bakery store in downtown Great Bend, Kansas, and she was excited to make the best of it. Unfortunately, just 3 days into her new job, Mandi would find herself the victim of a brutal and violent murder. 79-year-old Mary Drake had been a lifelong resident of Great Bend. On the evening of September 4th, 2002, she decided to stop in at the local discount bakery to pick up a loaf of bread. She would never make it home, having apparently stumbled upon Mandi and her killer either moments before or perhaps during the horrendous assault. Moments later, an unidentified man stepped out from the bakery, stuck the keys into the lock, and secured the door behind him. Passing a potential customer in the process, the man quickly noted that the bakery was closed. More than 20 years later, he has never been identified, the keys have never been found, and the murder weapon remains unknown. This is Trace Evidence, episode 228, The Murders of Mandi Alexander and Mary Drake. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine a case that is truly as frustrating as it is heartbreaking. In September of 2002, an unknown assailant entered the Dolly Madison Bakery in Great Bend, Kansas, and murdered 24-year-old new employee Mandi Alexander. Shortly thereafter, 79-year-old Mary Drake walked in to purchase a loaf of bread. The killer, still inside, did not allow her to escape. This is episode 228, The Murder of Mandi Alexander and Mary Drake. The Dolly Madison Bakery was a familiar fixture often utilized as a waypoint or landmark when giving directions or traversing across town. The large, brown brick building sits on the northeast corner of one of Great Bend's busiest intersections. Harrison Street, which nearly spans the entirety of the city, runs north to south, connecting with U.S. Highway 56, 10th Street, in the western half of town. Combined, these two major roadways carry a large proportion of Great Bend's daily traffic, from commuters making their way to and from work, to shoppers, errand runners, and those just out for a little joyride. There's a good chance that this particular intersection would play a role in their daily travels. Each day, thousands of people pass through that intersection, though how often they pay attention to their so familiar they're almost not even their surroundings can't be estimated. While some may roll to a stop for a red light and look curiously towards the surrounding shopping centers and parking lots, others will stare straight ahead, lost somewhere in their own thoughts as the world around them lingers beneath the tepid waters of a distracted conscience. Directly to the west of the bakery, across Harrison Street, sits a local bank that sees a large share of business throughout the week. South of that bank, southwest across 10th Street, is a McDonald's where busy breakfast rushes can see dozens of cars waiting for hot coffees and egg biscuits as they slowly move one by one through the drive-thru. For those seeking a more substantial meal, perhaps lunch with a friend, the local Applebee's is almost directly across Harrison Street to the east of McDonald's, cutting a southeast angle from the view of the bakery. Sitting to the east of the brown brick building on the same side of 10th, there's a low-cost motel, and then, of course, there is a smoke shop nearly butted up against the bakery's southern-facing exterior. Complicating an already busy intersection are the railroad tracks, which jut out from the southeast and pass through to the northwest. The tracks intersect with the road, making the general four-way layout slightly more complicated as a jungle of traffic lights hover above the different roadway options, intermingled with railroad crossing warning lights. Pedestrians walk and bike through the busy area, adding to the slow trek of traffic dancing between green and red lights. In fact, it is the utter busyness of this intersection that makes it such an unlikely target for crime, and yet more than 20 years later, it remains home to one of the most grisly, disturbing, and frustratingly unsolved homicides in Kansas state history. It was the evening of Wednesday, September 4th, 2002, when a truck driver employed by Interstate Brands, the parent company of the Dolly Madison Bakery, received a frustrating call. As part of the driver's normal job duties, he would often be directed to different bakeries that had a surplus of supplies and equipment. On this particular night, the driver, who we'll refer to by the pseudonym Dennis, was notified by his boss that they needed him to make an extra stop. Dennis was making the over 600-mile trek from Cheyenne, Wyoming, down south through Colorado and then east into Kansas, where he aimed to arrive in the city of Emporia, the seat of Lyon County. His route was about to change, however, as Dennis's boss explained that they needed him to go somewhat out of his way to make a stop in Great Bend. Dennis at the time tried to argue against the stop, but was informed that the bakery had contacted the office earlier in the day, making note that they had multiple baking racks and trays that needed to be picked up. The stop in Great Bend was really more about inconvenience than anything else for Dennis. It didn't take him dramatically off his planned route. Great Bend is right along the way to Emporia. But even a subtle shift in timing and travel can feel like a big difference when you just want to get home after a long trip. There wasn't much of a point in complaining, though, so Dennis accepted the new assignment and began shifting his route accordingly. The exact time that he arrived in Great Bend has never been publicly reported, though we do know that Dennis was not able to make his pickup at the bakery right away. Depending on the source, he either chose to stop and grab a bite of dinner first, or maybe found a car blocking the truck bay at the bakery and therefore decided to look for something to eat instead, assuming the vehicle would be gone upon his return. An article in the Hutchinson News notes that Dennis headed west along 10th Street, a little less than a mile from Dolly Madison, where he sat down for dinner at an Asian restaurant. A short time later, he arrived at the bakery, where he backed his truck up to the northwest corner, where the building had a large roll-up door for deliveries and pickup. It's been reported that Dennis did not approach the front door, nor did he attempt to contact anyone who may have been inside the business. Mark Dirks, then a spokesman for Interstate Brands, explained that drivers do not need to be granted access by anyone at the bakery itself. Although he would not go into specifics, it's been suggested that drivers were either in possession of universal keys or codes, which allowed them to open the roll-up doors from the outside without internal assistance. At that time, Dennis opened the door and began gathering up trays and rolling racks to load onto his truck. Reportedly, after a short amount of time, he was approached by a couple from nearby Hoisington. The couple quickly explained that they had placed a large order to pick up at the bakery, but having arrived at approximately 10 after 6, they had found the front door locked. This was frustrating to them, especially since the normal closing time for the store was 7 p.m. According to Dennis, he quickly placed a call to his supervisor in Emporia, who instructed him to fulfill the couple's order. Reportedly, as one of the customers was pointing towards the brand of hamburger buns she wanted, her husband noticed something red on the floor. Unsure of what might be going on, Dennis asked the couple to wait for him as he approached what quickly turned out to be blood that seemed to be coming from the office. I should note, the office in this building wasn't exactly a separate room, but a space partitioned off by lattice board. Walking into the small partitioned area, Dennis noted that the entirety of the space was soaked in a vast amount of blood, and as he glanced down, he spotted the shapes of two women lying face down. Although Dennis didn't have a great deal of experience with situations such as these, he knew enough to note that the victims appeared to be deceased. Completely freaked out and overwhelmed, Dennis dialed 911 with call logs showing that he contacted authorities at precisely 7:55 p.m. He later explained to the news, saying, quote, "They were sort of face down. It would just have been a guess that it was a gunshot. I couldn't see their faces. I thought about checking for a pulse, but there was so much blood, and they looked so lifeless." End quote. Investigators would later note that since the store was scheduled to close at 7 p.m., if Dennis hadn't stopped to pick up the bakery racks, there was a good chance no one would have become aware of the murders until the following morning. This was considered a stroke of good luck, getting onto the crime early, but it would ultimately become another frustrating detail of how law enforcement should have been in a better position to solve this hideous crime. At the time of the call, then Chief of the Great Bend Police Department, Dean Akings, was more than 6 hours away attending a conference being put on by the FBI. According to Akings, he requested assistance from a friend who was attending the same event and happened to work for the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. Reportedly, at the time police arrived on the scene, they found the door to the store closed and locked, barring them from entry. They would later contact an employee of the bakery who came down and provided her keys so they could obtain entrance. Akings asked that the KBI be dispatched to the bakery to manage, examine, and process the crime scene, while his own officers would be told to secure the scene, canvass the area, and gather up whatever information, evidence, or witnesses might be available. Depending upon who you ask, the crime scene was either highly secured and properly handled, as law enforcement has stated, or there was a steady flow of police officers in and out of the building, perhaps going so far as to take photos of the scene on their phones and allowing friends to take a look at the grisly scene, as locals and members of the family have claimed. Details surrounding the crime scene and the crime itself were tightly secured by law enforcement, who didn't appear interested in sharing much of what they had come to learn in those early hours of investigation. However, they did reveal the names of the two victims, those being 24-year-old Mandi Alexander, an employee of the bakery who had been hired just 3 days earlier, and 79-year-old Mary A. Drake, a lifelong resident of Great Bend. It was initially theorized that Mary Drake had come into the store to make a purchase and found herself in the wrong place at the wrong time. Investigators would not comment on the causes of death, nor would they reveal any potential motives. It was noted that this case was going to be investigated by the Great Bend Police in conjunction with the Barton County Sheriff's Department and the KBI. Mary Drake was born on Tuesday, February 13th, 1923 in Great Bend to parents Arthur and Mary. She would be one of 8 siblings, having 1 brother and 6 sisters. Mary would marry and have 3 sons who would be raised in Great Bend. Her family, which included 6 grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren, described her as an adventurous, caring woman who loved to cook and travel. Perhaps more than anything, she adored every moment she had to spend with her family, the most important people in her life. She had previously endured the tragedy of losing one of her sons when she was in her 20s, and that was followed up by a divorce. She went on to raise her surviving boys on her own, picking up work at the Fuller Brush Company, where she would be until she retired. One of Mary's granddaughters, Alicia, told reporters that her grandmother was her idol, someone she really looked up to and aspired to be like. She wanted to be sure that her grandmother was remembered for how she lived, as a mother, aunt, and sister, not for how she died. Alicia later told the Hutch Post that her fondest memories of her grandmother were from childhood sleepovers. She recalled how Mary would make up the sleeper sofa, provide Alicia and her sister with buttered popcorn and ice-cold Pepsis, and they'd stay up late watching Saturday Night Live. Mary loved every moment she had with her grandchildren, and they adored her just the same. Alicia explained, quote, "My grandma was my idol. She was my person. I can't remember a time or a memory that she was not a part of. She meant so much to my family that there are no words to express how grateful I am to have had her in my life." End quote. On the night of September 4th, Alicia had picked up the phone to call her grandmother to chat for a few minutes before bed. Curiously, Mary didn't answer. At the time, she didn't think much of it, as Mary was very independent and frequently spent time visiting with her sisters and friends. Alicia went to bed that night, but was awakened by a series of loud bangs at her front door. Upon answering, the police informed her about the horrible crime and requested that she get in touch with her father, one of Mary's sons. Together, they would make their way down to the bakery, which by this time was the center of all attention in Great Bend. Hundreds of people gathered outside watching the movements of investigators, while passers-by shouted out questions about what had happened and who might have been involved. Detectives spoke to Alicia's father, Ronald, trying to obtain information that might assist them, but there was little that could be offered. No one who knew Mary could think of a single person who would ever want to harm her, nor could they imagine circumstances which would have placed her life in any danger. Upon removal of Mary's body from the crime scene, the family gathered together at Ron's place, where they began making the heartbreaking calls to notify the rest of the family of the tragedy. The next day, Alicia and Ron would accompany the KBI to Mary's home, where a thorough search would be conducted. That search would yield as little helpful information as questioning had. No one could think of a single good reason why Mary Drake would have been killed at the bakery that night. It appeared to be a senseless murder. Across town and in several different areas surrounding Great Bend, the family of Mandi Alexander became aware in several different ways. Desiree Worth, one of Mandy's stepsisters, was watching the television news when the bakery was plastered on the screen. Moments later, she received a call from her sister, Dawn, explaining that something bad had happened at the bakery and there was a good chance Mandy had been injured. Within the next half hour, they were in the car and on their way to Great Bend to find out exactly what had happened. The revelation that Mandy was dead shocked and devastated everyone who knew and loved her, and they could only think of two things: how this was only Mandy's third day on the job, and how the hell were they going to tell her daughters. Mandy K. Sunderland was born on Monday, May 15th in Great Bend to parents Karen and Guy. Both Karen and Guy had children from previous in their lives, but Mandy would be their child together. Over the first few years of Mandy's life, she moved around a bit with her family. They left Great Bend, traveled through a couple of different cities and towns, and finally returned to Great Bend from Garden City in 1992 when Mandy was 14 years old. Mandy's been described by almost everyone who knew her as extremely shy but very loving. She was a kind, caring young woman who would do anything for anyone, but struggled when it came to herself. Friends and family noted that she didn't like what she saw in the mirror, believing she was too pale, and so she avoided having her picture taken if she could. One thing that was always true about Mandy was that she loved children, with friends noting that anytime they took a field trip to another school or got to be around younger kids, Mandy was just completely taken in by them. She loved to listen to them read and tell stories, and it was clear to anyone who was wise enough to see that Mandy would someday make a good mother. She attended Great Bend High School, though she would later drop out. She married and had her first daughter in the late 90s, but her life would get derailed. According to her mother, Mandy turned away from the church and fell in with the wrong crowd. She began abusing drugs and alcohol and spending time with violent, controlling, and abusive men. All of that would change in early 2002, however, when she gave birth to her second daughter. Sadly, her second daughter was born with a brain disorder and had to be airlifted to a Wichita hospital shortly after birth. This seemed to change something in Mandy, who made the decision to turn her life around in hopes of providing the best possible care and lives for her daughters. She turned back to the church and started making progress in changing her life for the better. Mike Joyner, pastor of the church Mandy attended, was moved by her ardent strides to create a better future. He told the Hutchinson News, quote, "Mandy was really moving forward with her life. The circumstances of her being a single mom with a special needs child really takes courage. I was proud of her. Her walk with the Lord was getting stronger and stronger." End quote. By August, things were looking up. Mandy, then 24, began renting a duplex apartment on Eisenhower Court on the west side of town. A bright red chair located on the front patio was frequently a place where Mandy sought out relaxation, moments to catch her breath, and to think about her plans for the future. In the late days of the month, she managed to get herself hired on at the Dolly Madison Bakery, which specialized in quick-sale, low-cost items. It was the place to go to grab a loaf of bread or some cupcakes at a discount price, and it was a popular spot in town. Mandy was excited to pick up the job. She could never have imagined that just a few short days later, she would go to work and never make it back home. Her mother, Karen, would later comment on the tragedy, saying, quote, "She was our baby, the youngest. We had our moments, but she was my baby, and I loved her to pieces. We can't believe she's gone." End quote. According to the families, the entire case was being handled by law enforcement in a highly secretive way, which led to them feeling somewhat out of sorts. By their own descriptions, over the next few days, there were cops all around them. Police attended the funerals and the viewings. They were at church services and memorials, anywhere they believed they might be able to learn something new. While everyone was happy to see the police working the case so hard, it could be difficult to move on with the daily course of your life when there's a policeman hovering just a step or two away, listening to everything. Within days of the murders, Chief Akings announced that a witness had come forward who described a suspicious man seen outside of the bakery around the time the murders are believed to have occurred. According to the witness, as he approached the bakery, this person appeared to be locking the door and casually told him that the store was closed. It's worth noting that this person seemed to be in possession of the keys to the store, keys which to this day have never been recovered, and the door was indeed locked when police initially arrived. The witness described the suspect as a white male, standing 6'1" to 6'2" and weighing around 175 pounds. The man had light brown to blonde hair and several days of beard growth. He was dressed in a faded black t-shirt, blue jean shorts, white socks, and a baseball cap. A composite sketch of this individual was put together and issued out to the media within 3 days of the double homicide, and it quickly began paying dividends. Chief Akings reported that they had received several calls in relation to the composite and were hopeful that they would uncover the man's identity quickly, though he noted that, as of that time, the man was merely wanted for questioning and was not officially a suspect. Asked for additional details about the crime, Akings wasn't ready yet to reveal what was known. Neither the murder weapon nor the cause of death was released to the public, though Akings did state that investigators believed the murders had occurred between 5 and 6:30 p.m. The chief noted that their next move was to begin going door to door in the surrounding area, hoping to find anyone who may have seen or heard something. At the same time, Chief Akings was trying to balance the investigation against a city that was quickly being pulled into the grip of fear. He explained, quote, "There's a lot of anxiety out there. There's no way I can assure them that everything's okay. The only thing I can say is today you have to be street smart. You have to try to watch out for yourself. The world can sometimes be a violent place." End quote. On Saturday, September 7th, it was announced that an $11,000 reward was being offered for information. Crime Stoppers put up $1,000 of the reward, with the rest being offered by Interstate Bakeries Corporation in Kansas City, which distributes to the Dolly Madison Bakery. In addition to this sizable reward, Crime Stoppers also noted that they were extending their hotline to be 24 hours a day. Chief Akings was hopeful, telling the Wichita Eagle, quote, "We have a lot of leads. We feel this will generate quite a few more calls." End quote. A lot of wild theories were being thrown around at the time, and the rumor mill was working overtime. One of the most popular rumors to emerge suggested that the murders may have revolved around Mandi herself. Given her past history with drugs and some of the violent men she had been around, a lot of people figured that she had been the intended target and that Mary Drake had the unfortunate timing to walk in at the wrong moment. However, a lot of people pointed out a key flaw in this theory. First was the fact that Mandi was killed on what was only her third day working at the bakery, making it unlikely too many people knew where to find her in the first place. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, Mandi wasn't supposed to work that night. She'd been scheduled to work an earlier shift, but one of her coworkers wasn't able to make it. This coworker needed to take her husband to an optometrist appointment, and Mandi was asked if she wouldn't mind covering. This seemed to throw somewhat of a wrench into the theory, as few people knew about Mandi's new job, and absolutely no one, except whoever she may have told that day, knew that she'd be working the closing shift. 3 days in, and she was already being asked to close by herself. According to the Hutchinson News, it was this same employee who called out that came to the bakery later that night to unlock the door for police. Nearly a week after the double murder, investigators continued to keep much of the details under wraps, but on Tuesday, September 10th, Chief Akings suggested that the cash register might reveal more about what had happened. According to the register, 2 purchases had been made between 5:15 and 6 p.m. that detectives hadn't yet been able to account for. It was believed at the time that finding the person or persons who made those 2 purchases could help bring new information to light. They may have seen something they didn't realize was important, and of course, investigators believe the murders occurred sometime during that time frame. Chief Akings urged the public to come forward with anything they might know, saying, quote, "We had a double homicide and we haven't arrested anybody yet. Our advice is the same as always. If you see or hear anything suspicious, call. We've got a tremendous amount of manpower on the case. Someone was there and saw something. That's all we need." End quote. Akings also revealed for the first time that there was in fact money missing from the cash register. Since nearly the beginning, the possibility of a robbery gone wrong had been batted about by law enforcement, though they would not discuss whether or not money had been taken. While Akings would not clarify how much was missing, it couldn't have been that much. Mark Dirks, spokesman for Interstate Brands, told the Hutchinson News that a manager gathered cash from the store and made a deposit at approximately 5 p.m., which means the 2 purchases between 5:15 and 6 were probably the only purchases made during that time. Unfortunately, this is when the case started growing cold. While investigators had a lot to work with, each lead pursued always seemed to bring them to a dead end. They couldn't make any headway, and between the rumors, the callers with unsubstantiated information, and the few callers with legitimate tips, there wasn't a lot that could be done. It would become, for lack of a better term, a game of evidence management and analysis. Sadly, depending on who you ask, the evidence in this case was either properly handled and cataloged, as investigators have stated, or it was the bungling of the evidence in the early hours that remains the primary reason this case is unsolved today, as friends and family have suggested. By early November, frustration was setting in. Nearly 2 months had passed, and yet there didn't appear to have been any major strides taken. By this time, the bakery had been reopened, but a new security camera system had been installed, and a large screen on the back wall vibrantly displayed 4 monitors at all times, telling both employees and customers that they were always being watched. For many, they felt this change in security was a positive and made them feel more secure, but for many more, they would never enter the Dolly Madison Bakery again. Too much horror, too much fear, too much concern that it could all happen again so long as the killer was free to walk the streets. Chief Akings, in discussion with the Wichita Eagle, revealed that detectives had, to that point, interviewed nearly 500 people, but still could not put together a solid lead on a suspect. At the time, the DC sniper investigation was ongoing, and it was considered possible that Mandi and Mary could have been victims of the murderous duo. There was a problem, of course. Neither Mandi nor Mary had been shot. Chief Akings eventually revealed that the 2 women had been murdered by bleeding to death. In the early weeks of the investigation, and even now, all these years later, police only described the murder weapon as a sharp instrument and have said that the women had had their throats cut. There has never been anything more specific stated, if known, and police have made it clear that the murder weapon was not recovered. Does that mean a knife, an ice pick, a box cutter, an axe? I suppose any of those could fall under a sharp instrument. The coroner, as well as Bruce Meller, then special agent in charge of the KBI's office in Great Bend, agreed that the women had bled to death. Chief Akings restated his belief that their best bet of finding answers would have to do with the register transactions that they hadn't yet been able to track down. He explained, quote, "We're still following up on leads, but it's slowing down. We're hoping to get the piece of information that's going to break it open. I really think that talking to the people who made those 2 transactions is pretty important to our case." End quote. The case was confounding for multiple reasons, many of which should already be adequately clear, but the nature of the crime itself was perhaps the most perplexing. A double homicide committed in broad daylight in a store at a busy intersection during the busiest time of day. In the absence of a solid motive, detectives tried to fill in the gaps, but every answer didn't make sense. Turning back towards the possibility of robbery, investigators could not come up with a rational reason why anyone would target the day-old bakery instead of one of the more busy and likely more lucrative targets nearby. Chief Akings stated, quote, "There was money missing out of the cash register, and that, as far as motive is concerned, is all we know. For what was taken out of there, if robbery was a motive, there's a whole lot of other places they could go for a whole lot more money." End quote. There was also a glaring piece of evidence that seemed to suggest that robbery might not be the motive. Sometime before Mary Drake was killed, it appeared as though she had entered the store and shopped. Whether or not Mandi was then under attack by her killer is unknown, but when police entered the establishment, they found Mary's purse sitting on the counter next to a loaf of bread she had apparently entered to purchase. Inside her purse, Mary's wallet was recovered, and nothing had been taken. It seemed a bit odd to enter a business with a robbery motive, but then to leave cash and credit cards behind that were well within reach. In February of 2003, 5 months after the murders, the KBI announced that they were adding $5,000 to the reward available for information by way of the Governor's Award. This raised the total reward to $17,000. While this stirred up more calls and tips, the vast majority of them were unhelpful. 5 months later, in July though, investigators would receive a call that put them on the trail of a potential suspect. The man, whose name was never revealed, was located in Independence, over 200 miles to the southeast of Great Bend. While this man was apparently identified to the KBI over their tip line, they were not involved in questioning the suspect. Chief Akings would later downplay the suspect, noting that he was only one of many. He explained, quote, "The man looks like the man in our composite drawings. Problem is, 1 out of every 10 or 15 men look like that composite. It's every man. He's just one of the many people we've checked out and will continue to check out. We see about people all the time who are out wandering about." End quote. Unfortunately, following this, the case would again begin growing cold. The families of both Mandi and Mary began organizing an event to take place at the Barton County Courthouse on September 4th, marking 1 year since the murders. Family members stationed themselves at a table where they provided information about the crime and encouraged visitors to write messages on balloons scheduled to be launched at 6 p.m., the time investigators have listed as the most likely moment the murders happened. In addition, the families were hoping to fund a billboard to be erected on the outskirts of Great Bend reading, "Do you know who killed our mother?" The billboard would include photos of Mandi and Mary, the composite drawing of the suspect, and information about the crime, as well as the $17,000 reward available. Mary's daughter, Michelle Drake, was present and explained the purpose of the event and the billboard, telling the Hay Daily News, quote, "Right now, we're looking for action. We know folks have read about what happened and we're sure they feel bad about it. The prayers we've received have been wonderful, but now this is a new level. We need to back all that up with action." End quote. Chief Akings, asked about the status of the case nearly a year later, had to confront the reality, acknowledging that the case was only getting colder. He would tell the Wichita Eagle, quote, "It always is any time you go about a year. We're still working though. We won't quit, and we're still optimistic. We'll get him. Our leads are dwindling. We need a spark." End quote. In the meantime, Michelle Drake launched a door-to-door program in hopes of obtaining donations. The plan was to acquire at least $3,000 to push the total reward available to $20,000. There was little else the families could do outside of raising awareness and appealing to the public for their assistance. Michelle Drake explained that they couldn't undo the horrors that had been done to their loved ones, but maybe they could help ensure that it never happened again. She would tell the Eagle, quote, "It won't bring my grandmother or Mandi back, but it will help take this guy off the street so no other family has to go through what we've been through." End quote. 4 months later, in January of 2004, The reward finally did climb over $20,000, but this did little to get the tips rolling in, and it started to feel like even investigators were giving up on the case. Kyle Smith, a KBI agent assigned, thought that it might help to turn the investigation over to their cold case unit, which had previously had success with cases local law enforcement couldn't crack. At the same time, he tempered any potential outcomes by noting how cases such as these can often take much longer to solve than you might think. He would tell the Salina Journal, quote, "These cases can be very frustrating. The important thing is patience. I prosecuted one case that took 10 years to solve. The thing you have to do amidst the frustration is continue to hope, pray, and work the case. Maybe some change in forensics or some new piece of evidence comes your way." End quote. By September of 2006, 4 years had passed, and it didn't appear investigators were any closer to finding the person or persons responsible. The families couldn't help but feel like they were being ignored and pushed aside, while local police moved on as if nothing had ever happened. Wanting to do something, one of Mandi's friends, Kathy Phelps, decided to utilize the then untapped potential of social media. She put together a MySpace page for Mandi, listing all the details of the case, playing audio, showing photos, and a slideshow of the murdered young mother. The goal was to get the story out to as many people as possible, under the belief that someone out there had to know something. Even law enforcement agreed it was highly unlikely that, 4 years later, the killer hadn't told someone about this crime. Phelps began sending out friend requests to thousands of accounts all across Kansas and then across the country. The more people saw the page, the greater she found the possibility of locating someone who might be willing to talk. She told the Salina Journal, quote, "MySpace reached millions of people, not just around the state, but around the entire world. If there's just one person out there that sees this profile and goes, 'Oh my God, I heard some guy talking about that.' If one person sees it and something very minute can come from it that could help lead to the murderer, then it served its purpose. It's so frustrating because you're looking for places to help you just to put it out there. Lacey Peterson, it was a national case. Everybody knows about it. What makes this story different? It's not. To get people to really look at the case, that's all we need. We don't need people to help solve it. We need people to know about it." End quote. In November of 2007, investigators finally released new information they hoped would help in bringing closure to the case. On Tuesday, November 27th, Chief Akings released a series of photos enhanced from security camera footage of the unidentified man seen outside of the bakery around the approximate time of the murders. This was the same man, allegedly, that a witness later told police he had seen locking the door to the bakery before telling him that the store was closed. Chief Akings claimed that they had waited 5 years to release the photos because the quality was poor and technology didn't yet exist to enhance them enough. That, however, would turn out to be a lie. Instead, the KBI would later admit they hadn't released the images previously because for 5 years, no one had bothered to watch the footage in its entirety. I'll repeat that. 5 years passed before investigators sat down to watch surveillance camera footage from a business next door to the bakery the day of the murders. 5 years to accomplish that. The man, who closely resembles the composite drawing previously released, is shown wearing a black t-shirt. On the front of the shirt, the word heads can be seen, though the rest is difficult to make out. Investigators have stated they believe the shirt is a Harley-Davidson brand and reads in full, "Heads above the rest." Akings stated that the unknown man had long, curly hair sticking out from under his hat and several days of beard growth, again, matching the composite. Akings went on to note that out of 300 people recorded on that video, this was the only person they had not managed to identify. The release of the photos resulted in a lot of new calls into police, but they weren't receiving the most helpful information. Chief Akings later stated that they had received several different names people believe could possibly be the man from the footage. David Bailey, a lieutenant with the Great Bend Police Department, went into greater detail, telling the Hutchinson News, quote, "We're pleased with the response the public has given us. I don't have an exact number in front of me, but the calls generated 20 to 25 new names for us to look at. We're in the process of running the names down and trying to locate them. The majority of names are local people, though some of them are out of state now. Some are names that are new to us." End quote. The most helpful call would come 3 months later in January of 2008, though, when the man in the photos picked up the phone and contacted authorities himself, telling them, "You don't need to look anymore. I'm the guy in the video, and I didn't do the homicide." Following the release of the images, the man was contacted by his son, who informed him that his photo was all over the news and he was allegedly connected to a double homicide. According to the caller, after he notified police, they quickly made the 300-mile trip north out of Kansas to speak with him in North Platte, Nebraska. According to the man, whose name has never been officially revealed by investigators, he was a frequent visitor of the smoke shop next to the bakery and did indeed stop by the shop the day of the murders. He claimed, however, that he was not involved in the crime and that police requested that he take a polygraph, which he did, and passed. After that, according to the man, police told him they appreciated his time and he was officially cleared of having been involved. This is perhaps one of the most perplexing aspects of this case. For more than 5 years, investigators made it clear that their best shot of solving the case would be to track down the man seen outside the store that day. Yet, when the man calls in and confirms that it's him on the video, he's cleared and dismissed rapidly. All these years later, though, the composite image is still being shown as though this is the person they're still looking for. Whether police believe it was a case of mistaken identity, whether there were two very similar men in the area that day, or whether it's something else entirely, we have no way of knowing, as authorities don't seem to have any answers when it comes to the man seen on that camera. September of 2012 marked a decade since the horrifying double homicide, and yet it appeared as though police were no closer to breaking the case than they had been the day it happened. No suspects had been named, no arrests made, no warrants sworn out, and no major developments. For the people of Great Bend, it was beginning to feel like one of those terrible crimes that goes unsolved for decades, haunting the town and becoming the core of rumors and speculation for generations. While the police weren't saying much, family members were getting tired of waiting for something to happen. Mandi's mother, Karen, sat down for an interview with the Great Bend Tribune and made the decision to reveal some information that had previously been kept under wraps. According to Karen, when police originally released the composite sketch of the suspect, they received a call from the manager of a local motel. According to the caller, someone had stayed at the motel the night of the crime who closely resembled the composite. What made the caller really suspicious was more so the person's behavior. She would claim that the man checked in the night of the murders, and when he checked out, he had completely shaved his head and face, eliminating long curly hair and a couple of days' growth of beard. Apparently, while investigators expressed interest in this person, they never did manage to track him down, and a decade later, this account had not been told by police to anyone publicly, so no one was looking for this guy either. Karen felt, much like other members of her and Mary Drake's families, that while investigators had done the best they could, mistakes had been made and they needed to be addressed. She would tell the Tribune, quote, "I thank law enforcement for all they did. They've done good work, but they also made mistakes. Please acknowledge the mistakes you've made." End quote. For the next decade, the case dropped from the headlines. There were, of course, mentions of the double homicide from time to time, generally when another serious crime was committed and went unsolved. For the families, a period of excruciating silence began, as not only were the media silent about the investigation, but so were police. This decade would take an already tenuous relationship between law enforcement officials and the families, and most shreds of unity that remained were torn asunder. Desperate to bring attention to the case, family members got the distinct impression that maybe law enforcement was beginning to believe that hiding their failures was more important than finding a suspect or making an arrest. Alicia Mung, Mary Drake's granddaughter, expressed her frustration, telling the Hutch Post, quote, "I have learned to deal with the anger for the most part, but I must admit that I'm still angry after 20 years. We are without answers and still no closer to justice and closure. I am angry because it doesn't seem in any way that law enforcement is trying to find these monsters. Most of all, I am still angry that someone took my person away from me." End quote. While 2022 marked 2 full decades since Mandi Alexander and Mary Drake were brutally murdered in the Dolly Madison Bakery, little had developed, and the case appeared to be stagnant. However, the curiosities and interests of a local man well aware of this cold case would shine a bright spotlight not only on the bakery, but on Great Bend as a whole. Aaron Mull, born in 1993 in Great Bend, lived in close proximity to the bakery and had never forgotten about it. In 2022, he began putting together a documentary in hopes of not only bringing attention to the case, but to potentially find out who may have been responsible. The documentary, entitled The Dolly Madison Murders, digs deep into the case, producing interviews with investigators and family members, as well as tracking down leads that law enforcement either dismissed or never pursued to begin with. While Aaron did his best to work with the KBI, he found that he was frequently hitting a wall with them, as though they were more suspicious of his documentary than of anyone who might have connections to the double murder. Then, the KBI did something none of the families expected. They called a press conference to announce new evidence in the case. Unfortunately, when the day came, the families found themselves once again short-handed. While the KBI had informed them of the press conference, they didn't reveal what the new evidence was. It would turn out to be a male DNA profile obtained from evidence kept from the crime scene. Unfortunately, it wasn't a strong enough profile to be put into a nationwide database. Instead, it could only be used in direct comparison with a suspect whose DNA was being tested. So, essentially, they remain in the same position they've been in for 20 years, lacking a suspect to test anything against. When the KBI presented this information as though it was a large breakthrough, the families were left unimpressed. According to them, the KBI had been in possession of this evidence for more than 20 years, and in the nearly 1 year that has passed since that press conference, nothing has come from it. Several family members were of the belief that the KBI made this announcement not to advance the case, but specifically in response to the documentary, wanting to show that, they're still working hard. Of course, you have to wonder, why would they think the documentary was going to doubt their investigative abilities? Possibly because the deeper you dig on this case, the harder it becomes to ignore all of the mistakes that were made. On top of that, the families felt strongly that investigators were ignoring them directly, never contacting them for status updates, follow-ups, or anything. Desiree Worth, Mandi's stepsister, would later say, quote, "They don't reach out to us. When we do call, the conversations are very short. The attention we get from there is not positive. It's not hopeful. It's just very short and like we're bothering them. That's how I feel." End quote. There were far too many revelations made throughout the documentary to discuss in this episode, but some startling information came from the man later hired to clean up the crime scene after investigators had finished processing the bakery. A large amount of blood evidence was left behind by investigators and was simply thrown away. This includes the desk from the office, stacks and stacks of blood-spattered papers and boxes, and the very cash register police had spoken so much about during the early part of the investigation. This was a case in which evidence was going to be incredibly important, and yet so much of it was simply discarded as if it didn't matter. You're talking about a crime involving a sharp instrument that resulted in 2 women having their throats cut. How, in 2002, could any police force be unaware of the vital importance of blood evidence in relation to DNA, let alone the high likelihood that the killer might have cut himself during the assault and some of that blood might have belonged to him? There is absolutely no excuse for this egregious oversight. it becomes clear why so many people believe this case was bungled from the get-go. Sadly, many of Mandi and Mary's family members have since passed away, never having made it to see the documentary released, nor to one day hopefully have seen an arrest made and justice served. Guy and Karen, Mandi's parents, passed away respectively in 2017 and 2022. Karen, luckily, was able to be interviewed for the documentary, though she didn't live long enough to see its release. Alicia Mung's father, Ron, who was Mary Drake's son, passed away in October of 2020. According to Alicia, her father desperately wanted to see someone held responsible for his mother's murder, though given the fact that he had more family, he feared to push the envelope too hard, believing the killer might come after him or another member of his family in retaliation. Mandi K. Sunderland Alexander was in her third day working at the Dolly Madison Bakery on Harrison and 10th in Great Bend on September 4th, 2002. Sometime between 5:15 and 6 p.m., it's believed an unknown assailant entered the bakery and assaulted Mandi, killing her. Sometime during or immediately following this murder, Mary Drake entered the bakery to purchase a loaf of bread and was presumably targeted by the killer, who had been unaware that someone had come in. Moments later, a witness claims to have seen an unidentified man exiting the building, putting the keys in the door and locking it, before announcing that the bakery was closed. This man, described as having long light brown to blonde hair, a few days beard growth, and wearing a baseball cap, could be the primary suspect in this case. While we know investigators tracked down the man seen in the surveillance footage, it would appear that the man in the composite is someone else, since to this day, the composite and descriptions are still listed on the KBI's website. The suspect is described as a white male, standing 6'1" to 6'2" and weighing approximately 175 pounds. He had collar-length, light brown to blonde hair and a slight beard. If you have any information about these murders, a $17,000 reward remains in place. While the documentary opened up a lot of doors, there are still so many secrets left uncovered. One fact that is heavily agreed upon by all involved, from the families to the investigators, is that someone out there knows what happened. This killer more than likely has talked. He's boasted about it or expressed some regret or shame. However, the idea that no one in this man's life is aware of this heinous and brutal crime is extremely unlikely. It seems, despite a lack of solid information, clues, and tips, the one thing this case has an excess of are theories, and we'll be getting to them next. September next month will mark 21 years since Mandi Alexander and Mary Drake were viciously murdered in the Dolly Madison Bakery on Harrison and 10th. In the more than 2 decades that have passed, Great Bend hasn't changed all that much. The bakery is now closed, being leased out as storage for office space. The signage of the time has been removed, and an additional roll-up door has been installed. The brown brick building still sits on the corner of that busy intersection, a harrowing remnant of an atrocious crime left unsolved, the grisly phantom of a nightmare come true, and with no resolution within reach. The murder of Mandi Alexander and Mary Drake has been in the forefront of my mind for a long time. Over the years, I've checked in on it, and sadly, most of the time I've seen there was no new details, no developments, no changes, really no news. It felt like with each passing year, the number of articles decreased and statements from investigators went from few and far between to nearly impossible to track down. I was never able to put my finger on what exactly it was about this case that bothered me, at least not over these last few years, but I may have finally figured it out. The reason this case sticks in my craw so much is because it should have been solved. There was a wealth of information and evidence available to investigators from the first moment, but somehow they couldn't make it work. You've got a ton, and I mean a ton of evidence just left behind for the crime scene cleanup team to throw away. Bloody papers, desks, merchandise, blood-splattered clipboards, a pack of cigarettes possibly belonging to one of the victims, even the cash register from which money was missing. Just thrown away because investigators at the time didn't find these objects worth keeping. In a case involving a sharp instrument, it apparently wasn't important to keep a large amount of the bloody items on the off chance that maybe DNA could play a role here. But nah, why bother handling things appropriately when you could just throw them out? I could go on and on about the evidence in this case and the mistakes made in the early hours, but there's not a whole lot of point in it. You can't undo it. You can't go back and make sure things are properly handled. So you're left in the present to deal with the case in the form and fashion as it currently exists, as flawed as it may be. I can't possibly cover all the different theories and avenues this case can take you down. There's far too much, and after all this time, it's extremely difficult to cut through the lies and rumors to narrow down to what is legitimate. And with investigators as silent as they are, it's difficult to know what's already been pursued, what's been ruled out, and what has never been looked at in the first place. So I think the best thing we can do is take a look at a few of the more prominent theories, weigh out the pros and cons, and see what, if anything, makes sense here. The key question of this case, which if answered could at least help direct the investigation, is one that's been asked since day one. Was this a random crime, or was this one of the two victims specifically being targeted? The answer to this question has been elusive over the past 20 years, and I don't know that we're any closer to it today than we have been at any other time. There are some who believe Mandi was targeted, and others who think that it was random. Some people have changed their position over the years, once believing in targeting, now believing in random, and vice versa. The primary issue with the idea of someone being targeted is that no evidence has ever been found to support that possibility. We don't have a long list of people who were apparently angry with or wanting to harm Mandi or Mary. We don't have police reports of them being stalked, receiving threatening messages or calls. We don't have friends and family members saying they were especially worried about this one person or that one person. None of that rules out the possibility of a targeted attack, but none of it really adds any solid weight to the possibility either. For the most part, it's been suggested that if someone was targeted, it was likely Mandi. Mary didn't appear to have any enemies out there, and in the aftermath of her murder, the investigation concluded that she was more than likely in the wrong place at the wrong time. She either walked in as the killer was attacking or immediately afterwards. We don't know a whole lot about the crime scene. For instance, we know Mary's purse and a loaf of bread were found on the counter. What we don't know is how she ended up in the office where the murders occurred. Were there any droplets of blood, bloody footsteps, or fingerprints found to suggest that Mary was forced into the office? Or is it possible someone called out for help and she went to check on them? Or could she have walked in, grabbed her bread, and then saw the killer standing there soaked in blood? Given how little has been said by police, we simply don't know. But if we accept that Mary was not the target and go down the line that Mandi was, there's a lot of different possibilities. Some have pointed out that Mandi had previously been involved with drugs and hung around some of the less trustworthy people. It's been theorized that she may have owed someone money, and at one point it was even suggested that Mandi may have been planning to testify against someone. Her family strongly disagrees with the latter statement, noting that had she been involved in anything like that, she would have told them. She wasn't the type to keep that to herself. So, with that avenue mostly cut off, people then turned towards her romantic life. Several friends and family members made comments that Mandi's ex-husband was a violent felon who she was desperately afraid of, and that she had dated several men who were controlling, violent, and abusive. In several articles, it was implied that Mandi may have been involved in some kind of a custody battle, but there doesn't seem to be a lot to that. Even after the murders, no one showed up to claim custody of either of her daughters, and according to the family, the fathers weren't even interested enough to try and help find justice for Mandi, let alone to care about their own kids. It's hard to believe that someone would have killed Mandi over child custody and then elected not to actually try and obtain custody. It's also worth noting here that Mandi's ex, the one she was scared of, had a really solid alibi for the night of the murders. He was in prison. So Then a lot of people began to wonder if maybe Mandi was targeted by someone who had an interest in her that she didn't return, maybe someone she found to be an annoyance, or perhaps someone she considered a friend who just wouldn't take no for an answer. It's been considered that this person may have come into the bakery that night specifically to see Mandi, and that when she turned away from him, told him to leave, or expressed her utter disinterest in pursuing a relationship with him, that he could have snapped and lunged at her. Things turned violent. Before he knows it, there's blood everywhere, and when he goes to leave, he's got Mary Drake standing at the counter staring straight at him. He can't leave any witnesses, and so he goes after her too. Some have even gone so far as to suggest that the crime, brutal as it was, may have been perpetrated by someone under the influence of drugs. Chief Akings in the documentary makes note of the fact that just the same as today, meth was a problem in Great Bend back in 2002. That makes things a little different, and while you could make the argument that someone all drugged up and angry entered the bakery specifically to attack Mandi, you could also make the argument that if the person was that drugged up, it didn't have to be personal at all. Amphetamines and rage frequently lead to explosively violent behavior. So could any of that have happened? Certainly, but again, it becomes a question of how it might all come together. Mandi was hired on at Dolly Madison in late August. September 4th, the day she was killed, was only her third day working there, and she was filling in for someone else who needed to swap shifts. Arguably, the only people that knew Mandi would be there at that time that night were her coworker and boss. She may have told a family member or a friend, but no one's made any comments about that. Now, were the assailants someone she knew and had reason to fear, it seems unlikely she would have told them where she was working and what time she would be there. But if it was someone she trusted, someone who she thought would never harm her, then it's entirely possible that she told them she'd be there that night. Just as a quick side here, there's been no mention whatsoever of any cell phones when it comes to this case. While I know 2002 was somewhat early in the cell phone game, it wasn't exactly the era of 10-pound Nokias with green and black screens. I have often wondered if police checked their phone records, text messages, call logs. Did either of them reach out to anyone, get a call or a message in the moments leading up to the murders? How about the bakery's phone records? Was that even something that was looked at? Again, we have no way of knowing. So you find yourself in this maybe yes, maybe no situation. Could Mandi have been targeted? Of course she could have, just like Mary could have. But again, there's been no evidence found to solidify any conclusion. But if it wasn't someone who targeted either woman, and if it wasn't someone that either woman knew, then it would had to have been a completely random attack that resulted in the murder of two women in a small discount bakery sitting at a busy intersection in broad daylight at the busiest time of day, yet no one sees anything. No one hears anything. No one even notices until the delivery driver arrives. One angle of the stranger theory that's come up several times has to do with the person who was allegedly sighted at the motel near the bakery the night of the murders. According to the former manager, the man checked in on September 4th, and when he checked out, he had completely shaved his long hair and facial hair, leaving himself bald and smooth-faced. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds like a hell of a lead to me. You'd imagine the police pursued that right down to the ground, but unsurprisingly, it sounds like no part of that theory was followed up on for several days after the man had already checked out and moved on. What makes this angle really interesting is that according to Mary Drake's granddaughter, Alicia, the manager of the hotel told the police that when the man checked in, he was in possession of an item that had belonged to her grandmother. What exactly this item is, I can't say. Alicia didn't want to reveal the details as police had instructed her not to. But if this is true, then what a tremendous travesty of justice this entire investigation is. You have a man checking into a hotel less than 900 feet from the bakery the night of the murders, and when a description is issued of a long-haired, stubbly-faced suspect, this guy completely shaves his head and face. No one thought that was suspicious enough to warrant an immediate look. You know, over the last 20 years, the one thing investigators have said more than anything else is that they need help from the public. They need tips. They need calls. Well, what good are tips and calls when you don't follow up on them until it's too damn late? It would be funny if it wasn't so goddamn sad. Another aspect of the circumstances surrounding this case that make the hotel guy interesting has to do with what was happening in Kansas at the time. The day before the homicides was Labor Day, and a massive parade and carnival were being held not far north of Great Bend. This, of course, drew in a lot of people who normally wouldn't be in the area, from people traveling with the carnival to transients to people from all around the state who came just for the big party. A lot of people have considered that the reason no one has been caught yet was because thousands of people completely unknown to any locals may have passed through Great Bend that week. That doesn't necessarily hammer the nail in, but it sure makes the possibility more intriguing. Now, there's a lot of other aspects to this case that could be pursued, but a lot of them seem to come out of the realm of rumor and speculation. There's the situation with a guy who was, at the time, a district manager over many Dolly Madison bakeries. While I'm not going to reveal his name, he was later tied into several criminal activities at different places of employment, from pretending to have been robbed so that he could pocket cash from the register to an alleged arson case. A lot of people wondered what he might know, if anything. But his name hasn't come up in regard to the investigation, and outside of his shady history, there doesn't appear to be anything directly linking him to the crime. Then there's a man named Dilton Myers. Myers, who has an extensive criminal history that resulted in his ultimately being shot and killed by the FBI in 2012, previously worked at the bakery and allegedly was big on telling people how easy it is to rob the place. According to several people, Myers would give specific instructions about entering the store and then asking the employee to check the back room for an item that isn't out on the shelves. Deposits made in a zip-locking bank bag would frequently be stored in an empty space beneath the cash register, completely unsecured. Reportedly, Myers told folks that once the employee goes into the back to check for your item, you can just grab the bag and walk out. What's really interesting is if you go back through the records, it appears that throughout the 1990s, the Dolly Madison Bakery was robbed or stolen from a whole hell of a lot. For a place where it's constantly noted that it's a popular spot with a lot of traffic, it looks like people came in and stole from this place all the time. So is it possible that someone came in to rob the store, maybe by their own method, maybe just trying to grab the bag as described by Dilton Myers, and something went very wrong there? Of course, some have gone so far as to suggest that Dilton himself could have been involved, and while no evidence has ever been presented to confirm this, it is suspicious that he moved to Louisiana not long after the murders and then changed his name. With him deceased, though, there's no way of knowing what he may or may not have been up to. So in the end, we're left with the same questions that have haunted this case from the very beginning. Who could have done this? Could one of the victims have been targeted? Was it someone local or someone passing through? Was it a robbery gone wrong, or was it a random act of violence from a disturbed individual or someone on drugs? Well, in the interest of making things even more complicated, I have a few of my own questions I'd like to close with as we come around to the end of the conclusions here. There's a lot of theories, like I said earlier, far too many to tackle all in one episode. But I do think it's worth asking about a few things that, despite my sincerest efforts, I have not been able to uncover. According to the investigation, the Dolly Madison Bakery was scheduled to close at 7 p.m. on the night of the murders, which are believed to have occurred between 5:15 and 6, though probably much closer to 6. When Dennis, the driver, arrived to pick up the racks and trays that night, it's been noted that he didn't need to go in through the main door, as drivers have access to the roll-up door leading directly into the stockroom. There is some conflicting information out there about how everything occurred that night, with the driver's own statements to the media seeming to contrast what investigators would claim. For instance, the KBI stated as recently as 2022 that the driver had discovered the bodies while making a routine stop at the bakery, but that's not true. This wasn't a routine stop. It wasn't even on Dennis's schedule until he was contacted by the front office and directed there. As an aside, for the record, the driver passed away not long ago, and while his real name is out there publicly, I've elected to use the name Dennis at the request of his surviving family. So, by his own account, Dennis had been inside the stockroom of the bakery for a period of time, grabbing racks and doing work before he was approached by the couple who had come to pick up a large order. Now, it's reported that this couple tried the front door of the bakery and found it closed and locked at 10 after 6, approximately 10 to 15 minutes after police think the murders took place. So this couple arrives, finds the door locked, and then what? I haven't seen a single interview or accounting of who this couple was, where they went, and what they may or may not have seen. You think it would be pretty important since they were in the parking lot close to when the crimes occurred, but with as much information seems lost or inaccurate in this case, it's just a needle in that haystack. So these people walk up to Dennis and explain the situation. He then takes out his cell phone and calls his boss asking what he should do, at which time he's advised to fulfill the couple's order. So he starts grabbing items for them, at which time the blood is spotted by the husband. Dennis goes to check and reportedly walked into the office where he saw a massive amount of blood and the two bodies on the floor, possibly positioned so that the desk was partially obscuring them. At that point, Dennis contacts the police and that call is reported to have come in at 7:55 p.m. So one question I've always had is, why the hell was that couple still there? The door was locked at 10 after 6, but more than an hour later, they're still hanging around this bakery waiting to see if anyone shows up. Maybe it's just me, but I find that a bit odd. Now, according to the driver's wife, when police arrived on the scene, he was questioned, and they eventually took his shoes and belt to process for potential evidence. It makes sense, he would have had to have walked through some of that blood, which could have gotten on him. But at the same time, why wouldn't they have taken his pants and shirt and anything else he was wearing that might have had evidence on it? According to the wife, police later asked for his work clothes, but by that point, she'd already washed them, so she wasn't even sure which ones to give them. Speaking of the parking lot, here's another question that's always bothered me. In the documentary, Mandi's sister Desiree makes it clear that after police processed her car, it was turned over to the family. Desiree quickly discovered a threatening letter in the car, apparently sent to Mandi by her ex, who made it clear that if she was seeing someone else, he'd kill the guy. Of course, since investigators didn't take this letter, it seems like either they didn't consider it pertinent to the investigation of a double murder, or, as the family believes, they didn't really search that vehicle too thoroughly. Shocking. Back to that parking lot, though, the way it is laid out at the time, people parking at the bakery travel onto Harrison Street and turn to the east, pulling into one of only a handful of spots that are right outside the front door, which face to the west. So you're telling me that Dennis arrived that night, pulled up to the roll-up door, which is located on the northwest corner of the building, approximately 40 feet from the front door, and is also facing west. What I'd really like to know is, did he not notice the two cars parked in front of the bakery? Did he not notice the lights still on inside? Did he not find it odd that he's in the stockroom to grab these racks, but there's significant evidence someone else is probably in the building, but he never checks, he never hears anything, he never gets curious? Now, I've worked in some half-assed jobs in my life where corners are constantly cut, but even they had logbooks that vendors and delivery people were required to check in and out with. I'm guessing that wasn't the case here? Maybe it all adds up to a bunch of nothing, but I've always found it difficult to believe that he'd pull in at that time and fail to notice anyone else there. That this couple would approach him about their order, but they wouldn't make note of the fact that while the door is locked, it looks like it should still be open. Did they not mention that the two cars in the parking lot, when they spoke to the driver, were also still there all that time later, there when they show up at 6:10, there when they speak to Dennis? Who knows? Maybe he's frustrated with the added stop and he just wants to get the work done. But if I were stopping in that night and I saw the cars and the lights, I'd have wondered enough what was going on to have walked through the stockroom to the front to check it out. Of course, I'd have encountered the blood-soaked office before I could get that far. That doesn't happen with Dennis, though. He is seemingly completely unaware anything is wrong until the husband of the couple points out the blood creeping across the floor. Now, I should say, I'm not suggesting that Dennis was involved in this crime, but I think these questions are relevant. I mean, this is the guy who finds your crime scene, who first discovers the bodies. I'd have a hell of a lot of questions I'd be asking. It doesn't look like that really happened here. So, like so much of this case, we're stuck with these circumstances that just don't make sense. The last thing I want to talk about is blood. We know that both women at a minimum had their throats cut with the so-called sharp instrument, and that their causes of death were determined to be due to blood loss. Everyone who saw the crime scene described it similarly. There was blood everywhere. There was blood on the floor, the desk, paperwork, the walls, and even on the ceiling. It was stated that the only spot on the floor that appeared to be somewhat blood-free were the spaces where Mandi and Mary's bodies were laying. Now, what I'd like to know is, how in the hell did someone commit a crime that absolutely bloody and manage to walk away without anyone noticing? You have to consider, especially with neck wounds, the killer would have been covered in blood. Evidence at the scene suggests that the killer walked into the bathroom and spent some time trying to clean himself before leaving. Now, I don't give a damn how long he spent at that sink. Short of a powerful shower, you're not getting all that blood off of you. Even if you manage to clean it from the obvious areas, it's going to be under your nails, in your nostrils, in your hairline, in every creased piece of skin on your arms, neck, or face. Not to mention the clothes. That sink isn't going to do much of anything to help clean them up. This simple fact, the sheer messiness of the blood and spatter, makes it difficult for me to believe a lot of theories in this case. Go back and look at some of the possibilities we've talked about. There's that hotel guy, right? Well, unless the manager of the hotel noticed the dude had blood all over his clothes, it's somewhat hard to believe he was involved. I wasn't trying to imply any possible suspicion about the driver, but even if he were someone you looked at, he would have been covered in blood as well. Something here doesn't make any sense, and it pretty much sounds like whoever committed these murders wiped himself up, walked out, and just disappeared into the night. Unless, of course, he had someone working with him. Maybe someone waiting to give him a ride or to provide a change of clothing. There is, sadly, at this time, no way of really knowing. There are a myriad of unanswered questions in this case, and the deeper you dig, the more you find. For 20 years, the families of Mandi Alexander and Mary Drake have hoped that justice would be served. They have fought to keep the cases in the spotlight and have done everything in their power to find the truth. Instead, the cases have grown even colder, the investigators have turned away from them, and they're left to fend for themselves, wondering why those charged with serving and protecting their loved ones seem more interested in protecting their own reputations and pride. It's a double tragic situation. It's traumatizing enough to lose your daughter, your sister, your mother, your grandmother. But it's even worse when you feel like the people who should care the most don't have the slightest interest. This case, like so many, is going to come down to you. Those of you listening, those of you who watched the documentary, those of you who know what happened here and for reasons passing understanding have elected not to come forward with the truth. Or perhaps you did, but you were ignored. Don't let these two women's lives get washed away like they didn't matter. Speak up. Try to help these two families find closure and stop this from happening to another family. Because sadly, unless someone comes forward, new evidence is uncovered, or the killer confesses, the murders of Mandi Alexander and Mary Drake will remain open, unsolved, and growing colder by the day. If you're looking for more information about the murder of Mandi Alexander and Mary Drake, there are many newspaper articles and forums discussing their case. For this episode, I found the Wichita Eagle and Salina Journal most helpful. In addition to these resources, I cannot more highly recommend checking out Aaron Mull's documentary, The Dolly Madison Murders. It is available for free on Tubi, and in addition to the documentary, Aaron also did a nearly 2-hour podcast episode discussing all of the information he couldn't fit into the documentary. I will provide both a link to the documentary and to Aaron's YouTube channel in the show notes. If you have any information about the murder of Mandi Alexander and Mary Drake, please contact the Kansas Bureau of Investigation at 1-800-KS-CRIME. You can also contact Barton County Crime Stoppers at 1-888-305-1300. Remember, a reward of $17,000 is still available for helpful information. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. At this time, I'd like to take a moment to thank some of our amazing Patreon producers. Andrew Guarino, Ann Bertram, Alicia Lorraine, Camelia Tyler, Christine Greco, Danny Renee, Dirthy, Denise Dingsdale, Donna Buttram, Diane Dyson, Eloanne Meyer, Guillerme Pinto, Jennifer Winkler, Julie Mangano, Justin Snyder, Kara Moreland, K.Y., Kelly Michelle, Lars Jensen Fangel, Leslie B., Lisa Hobson, Madison Mahulier, Melissa Breckeisen, Nick Mohar Schurz, Nicole Kingbird, Stacy Finnegan, Stephanie Eve, Stephanie Joyner, and Tom Radford. I can't begin to express just how much all of your support means to me, as without all of you, Trace Evidence would not be possible. If you're interested in learning more about this case or other cases featured on the show, please visit trace-evidence.com. There you can find case breakdowns, all social media links, merchandise shops, case descriptions, media, and options for donating, including PayPal and Patreon, should you wish to support the show. This concludes our look into the 2002 murders of Mandi Alexander and Mary Drake at the Dolly Madison Bakery in Great Bend, Kansas. A truly frustrating and yet extremely solvable case. Someone out there knows something. Hopefully, sooner than later, they'll come forward with what they know. I want to thank you all again for listening, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.